I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 6 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Pursuant to a motion adopted on Tuesday, February 8th, the committee is meeting on the review of the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. Before I welcome the witnesses, I'll just let you know I use a little cue cards, so when you have 30 seconds left, I'll raise that, and when you're out of time, I'll raise that. I ask out of respect of time if you can comply by those. It's the only way all our members will get their questions, and if you miss something, you can usually add it in the questioning from some of the members. So I'd now like to welcome the members. I think there's some members, some witnesses, that we're still trying to connect, and if our clerk will attempt to do those. So you'll speak for 5 minutes as a witness for your group, and then the next witness will speak, and then subsequently there'll be question and answers by the round. And I see Mr. Fortin has joined, so I'm glad to have you. So the first witness, if Jen Clement from the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform could go for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Our alliance is made up of 25 sex worker rights groups across the country, led predominantly by sex workers living the impacts of PCPA, and also who serve thousands and thousands of sex workers through frontline services and advocacy. I'll use my time today to dispel of some of the myths and misinformation and unfounded statements that the committee has heard over the past 3 weeks. My intention in doing that is to redirect your attention to rigorous empirical research needed for you to complete your task to study the impacts of PCPA. One such myth is this erroneous division between exploited survivors on the one hand and independent sex workers or entrepreneurs on the other. All witnesses, including sex workers, are presenting evidence about people who sell or trade sex in difficult circumstances, and most with limited options. Yet a false divide is being created as if people's experiences fall within one of two categories: people who have agency and don't experience abuses, and those who do experience abuses and don't have agency. Many sex workers do experience exploitation and violence, yet sex workers across the country, if not the world, recognize that this is in part due to the impacts of criminalization. Recognizing the harmful impacts of criminalization doesn't mean that you're abandoning one group over the other. Rather, you're recognizing how criminalization functions, and particularly how it most negatively impacts the most marginalized sex workers living and working in the most difficult conditions. Criminalization is a tool that encourages social and racial profiling, and it is an absolute deterrent to anyone reporting violence, abuse, or exploitation. Supporters of PCPA claim the average age of entry is 12 to 14 years old. This is a discredited claim. Young people do experience abuses both in and out of the sex industry, but massage parlors, strip clubs, and agencies are not rife with 12 and 13-year-olds, and this is not the average age that people start to sell or trade sex. Misinformation about the average age of entry is what researcher John Lohman calls a cornerstone of prohibitionist rhetoric. He says that treating prostitutes as children makes it much easier for prohibitionists to argue that women should be saved from ourselves. Discredited claims about the age of entry are circulated by people who support criminalization and PCPA. Most recent empirical research paints a very different picture. A 2018 study by Cecilia Benoit indicates 24 years of age as the average age of entry. 2011 study by Vandermeulen indicates it to be 20, and a 2007 study by O'Doherty found it to be 23 years of age. Supporters of PCPA claim it addresses violence against sex workers. None of the PCPA offenses, including the client and third-party offenses, require any element of exploitation or coercion. Empirical evidence confirms that criminalizing any aspect of sex work forces people currently working in the industry to forego security measures and endure poor working conditions to avoid detection. PCPA fosters exploitation and violence. Proponents of PCPA claim that it's an equality model. A legal regime that relies on the surveillance, profiling, detention, and arrest of marginalized and racialized communities cannot claim to be an equality or a feminist model. A legal regime that criminalizes and seeks to eradicate an income-generating activity predominantly exercised by marginalized women cannot claim to be an equality or feminist model. Equality means that everybody receives the benefit of human rights protections, and substantive equality means that there's a recognition that criminal law, and PCPA in particular, disproportionately targets racialized Black, Asian, and Indigenous communities. PCPA encourages the uninvited presence of law enforcement into the lives of these sex workers and has grave consequences. A last myth is that you've heard, but you've heard more than this, is that the law is not harming sex workers, but it's sex workers' misunderstanding of the law. Sex workers know that PCPA is designed to criminalize their work and eradicate them and their means of survival. The criminalization of sex work produces real risks and impacts on how sex workers organize their lives. The harms of criminalization go beyond arrest. They create barriers to access to health and social, legal, or police services. They foster isolation and limit sex workers and who we can reach out to for support. They create the risk of eviction, and they create the risk of child apprehension. The dangers of PCPA and police that sex workers speak of are most definitely real, not a figment of sex workers' imagination, or definitely not an instruction from some imaginary pimp. Empirical evidence matters. This review needs to prioritize empirical evidence and the experiences of people working under PCPA. The preamble is based on complete fiction that sex work is inherently exploitative, and it reproduces stigma that increases targeted violence against sex workers. Verify and the unfounded claims made to you these past couple weeks around age of entry, number of women who have agency, or the alleged failure of the New Zealand model. There are no methodologically sound sources for these claims. At what point do sex workers, people currently working in the industry, get to be experts of their own lives? Thank you.
Ms. Clement. I will next ask Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project, Jenny Duffy, the board chair, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project is one of Canada's oldest funded sex worker justice organizations. For over 35 years, we've supported sex workers in Toronto through drop-in programming, harm reduction services, legal supports, food security efforts, and more. Our work is in direct response to the harms caused by legislation like Bill C-36. The majority of sex
Ms.
workers...
Ms. Duffy, sorry to interrupt. Would you be able to open your camera so they can see you? Perfect.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. I didn't realize it turned off.
Continue.
The majority of sex workers we serve are from poor, working class, racialized, and Indigenous communities, members of the LGBTQ2S community, and work as street-based sex workers. We launched culturally specific services, including the nation's first Indigenous-led program for sex workers and emergency supports for Black sex workers who face compounded forms of violence as a result of criminalization. Bill C-36 claims to protect sex workers, but in practice, it isolates us from supports and facilitates violence. It recreates the impacts of the former unconstitutional laws for sex workers. In 2017, one of our longtime community members, Alora Wells, went missing. She was a 27-year-old Black and Indigenous trans woman who attended our drop-in programming and navigated poverty, homelessness, and police violence in the city. Following her disappearance, Alora's father contacted Toronto Police to report her missing. He was told the case wasn't a high priority. Instead, police told her father that people like Alora are transient. They disappear and reappear all the time. We formed our own search parties led by longtime trans activist Monica Forrester. Because of our public efforts demanding justice for Alora Wells, 5 months after her initial disappearance, Toronto Police caved to the pressure and finally issued a missing persons report. A short while later, a community member named Rebecca contacted Maggie's with news that she discovered a body in the Rosedale Valley and had actually contacted police months before. Police did not issue a news release when the body was reported, and they did not release details to the public as they normally would. Rebecca followed up multiple times with Toronto Police to learn about developments, even reaching out to the 519 Church Street Community Centre, who promised to have staff investigate. The 519 did not follow up with Rebecca or our community. After seeing media coverage about our search parties for Alora, Rebecca reached out to us at Maggie's. So despite Alora's father attempting to issue a missing persons report much earlier on, the heavy news coverage of Alora's disappearance, and the community member notifying service organizations, we had not been informed about this key development. Only after following up with police about Rebecca's discovery did they agree to retest DNA, and on November 23rd identified Alora's body. They maintain that the cause of death can't be determined, but estimated she died sometime in July. Toronto police dismissed Alora's disappearance because of her background in sex work, her race, gender identity, and struggles with homelessness. When laws like Bill C-36 mark our communities as social problems to be eradicated and instruct police to criminalize sex workers, our ability to access basic support and safety is undermined. Indigenous women, Black and racialized women, transgender women, migrant women, and people living through poverty are overrepresented in street-based sex work. The combination of the offenses against communication, purchasing, and the presence of police pushes street-based workers and their clients into remote areas. Working in poorly lit back alleys far from their homes, social services, and their peers, street-based sex workers that we serve at Maggie's report increased difficulty screening their clients, detecting violent situations, and negotiating consent. Street-based workers at Maggie's have consistently disclosed about harassment from law enforcement and being forced to relocate around the city to avoid police. During our COVID-19 emergency support fund, one of the many Indigenous sex workers who reached out for financial aid was a young Anishinaabe street-based worker experiencing harassment and aggression from police while struggling to work and survive during the height of the pandemic. Bill C-36 facilitates this violence and excludes us from solutions to improving our working conditions. One of the most devastating consequences of this law is that our communities are made responsible for the violence enacted on us. It's in this context that sex worker justice organizations like ours have been essential spaces to organize, support one another, and continue fighting for decriminalization like the life and death issue that it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Duffy, you still had 20 more seconds, but appreciate the promptness. Next, I'll have Pierre.
Maintenant, entendons Pierce Victoria Resources Society. Je ne sais pas si Sophia Caravella ou Sarah Smith qui fera l'exposé, mais c'est à vous la parole.
Hello. Pierce Victoria Resource Society is a local grassroots organization for sex workers in Greater Victoria. Since 1995, we have offered outreach, drop-in, housing, health, violence prevention, small business training, and peer support worker training services, and more. We serve about 650 unique individuals a year. We believe strongly in the experiential voice that our community knows best how to take care of ourselves. As such, 2/3 of our staff have current or former experience in sex work. We come to you from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. The PCEPA severely undermines health and justice for sex workers. Because of the criminalization of the stopping of traffic for the purpose of selling sexual services and the criminalization of the purchase of sexual services, sex workers are forced into rushed and clandestine negotiations with clients, with reduced ability to screen clients or assert their boundaries. Further, street-based sex workers are forced to work in isolated areas further away from public spaces. Much research has shown that criminalization of any group in society, including sex workers, increases social isolation, poor health outcomes, and reduces access to public supports. Escort agencies offer much-needed work-setting options for sex workers, particularly those newer to the work, because they offer safer group spaces and peer mentorship. However, these spaces are prohibited by Section 236.2.3 and .4. In our community, these businesses are all women-run, long-term establishments that offer a desirable work setting for many of the sex workers served by our organization.
Ms. Ciavarella, if I may, can you just slow yourself down? The interpreters are having a hard time staying at pace with you. Thank you.
I apologize.
No worries.
With sex work legally defined as inherently exploitive, violence against sex workers' bodies is naturalized. When the only way of helping sex workers is to rescue them, those that are actively engaged in sex work are seen as disposable. Their voices are deprioritized and they face barriers to justice. In the past 4 years, not a single reported case of violence my organization has supported sex workers through has led to an arrest or formal charges, despite a rare collaborative working relationship between peers and the Vic PD. Among a cohort of cisgender and transgender sex workers in Vancouver, 72.2% of participants reported no perceived change in working conditions following the passage of PCEPA, and 26.4% reported negative changes. They also reported less access to health and community services under the new legislation. In the same cohort, 38.2% of participants experienced violence following PCEPA, reported violence to the police, which did not differ significantly from pre-PCEPA reporting. Immigrant and racialized sex workers were more likely to report negative changes and less likely to report violence to the police. We think it is time to truly prioritize the well-being of people in the sex industry. We need to remove the criminal code as a barrier to well-designed public supports. These supports need to focus on universal basic income, gender-based violence prevention, housing, and peer-based initiatives that reduce stigma. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ciavarella. Are you sharing your time with Ms. Smith? Yes. So for 2.5 minutes, Ms. Smith.
Hi. Just making sure you can hear me because I had lots of technical difficulties.
Interpreters, are you good? Can you say something for 5 seconds, 5 to 7 seconds? Just say a sentence, your name,
Something
how's
for
the
5
weather?
to 7 seconds. This is something for 5 to 7 seconds, and I had some technical difficulties here and very warm sweating because of the pressure, like there wasn't enough pressure. Is that good?
Yes, they said they should be okay with that. Yes, thank you. Continue.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. Each of the following paragraphs are comments garnered by the sex worker community of Peers Victoria Resources Society when asked how the law and stigma impact one's life. So these are all quotes. One view is that you feel unsafe in your outside environment, living with the daily effects of stigma. Another, your entirety as a human being is discarded by what you do to pay your bills. And another, I'm a good person. My house is clean. I am clean. I give love and I care for a living. How bad could I be? And another, it keeps me stuck in my situation, unable to move into different things, even if I'm making every effort to do so. Another, I can get an education and still be haunted by the stigma of having been a sex worker. Another, my life would be a transformed experience of great significance under decriminalization. Current legislation isolates the marginalized, vulnerable communities, women, Indigenous people, Indigenous women, LGBT community members who are human too. The law is perpetuating violence on the basic human rights of those people. Another person said it builds hatred, separation, isolation, addiction, hopelessness, and mental health issues. Sex work stigma has distanced me even from my family. Another person said, if our society respected us and our work as human beings too, that would set a different tone to families and among one another on the micro level. Still another, it's impossible to find housing without lying on rental applications. Landlords will not rent to me. If I do manage to secure housing by lying, I'm constantly at risk of homelessness if my landlord finds out. Being out as a sex worker has lasting consequences, like being unable to secure another job due to involvement in the sex trade. Another person said, stigma has made it difficult for me to access a legal representative to incorporate my business. Every lawyer I've reached out won't touch me with a 10-foot pole. It's frustrating knowing that I'm operating legally, but not unable to hire legal counsel, a driver, security, etc., because they're criminalized under the current law. I'm trying to play by the rules and running my business, but I'm always tiptoeing around the bank, landlords, etc. Another person said impacts caused by laws such as risk of being banned by other countries when traveling abroad simply for being a sex worker, even with no proof of any plans to work in another country. Another, no housing protections. If a landlord discovers what I do, I can be evicted even with only suspicion. And lastly, the assumption that sex workers would choose this work intentionally, not just as a last resort, ignoring the many voices of people who do what they do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for staying within the time. I'd next go for the first round of questions. It'll be for 6 minutes, starting with Mr. Moore.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses today as we finish up a very important study. We know that this legislation came about after the Bedford decision. It's an attempt to strike the right balance, but there's always improvements that can be made. I note that just in the last few days, we've seen the Court of Appeal of Ontario upheld several of the provisions of PSEPA or C-36, and but that brings us to this study. We're studying ways we can improve the law and how the law is working. We've certainly heard from a wide variety of witnesses, some who are very supportive of PSEPA. So I do have a question. I'm going to ask it to the Peers Victoria Resources Society. I know there's two witnesses here, so I guess you could decide amongst yourself who would like to answer. But it was mentioned that you provide harm reduction, support services, education, employment training for current and former sex workers. Could either of you elaborate on some of what those support services look like? education and employment training as well. Maybe share with the committee what that looks like typically, the services you're providing for your region.
Okay, I'll speak to that. I run the small business training program at Pierce Victoria Resources Society. So we're not an exit organization. We look to support current and former sex workers where they're at, knowing full well that some other employment opportunities don't offer the best perks or rates of pay. So with that in mind, we look to support people where they're at, whether they're continuing in the sex trade or if they want to branch out. So with the small business training program, we go through everything to run a small business, whether someone has a small business they already have established and are looking to continue it, or whether they're starting a small business, or whether they're starting or continuing their own small business that is sex work. And in that curriculum, we cover everything from vision statements, mission statements, partnership agreements, staffing agreements, municipal bylaws. Gosh, there's so much, and I'm kind of at a loss right now.
Well, that covers a lot of it.
Yeah, it's a lot. I also I apologize. Well, I also run the drop-in center for about 7 years. I just gave the position up late last year. So the drop-in center is somewhere where everybody comes in to get a healthy meal and a sense of community. You really can't discount the sense of community, because when you're stigmatized the way that sex workers are in our society, you feel awful out in the real world, and you don't feel that you have a community or a family or people that you can be yourself around. So at the drop-in center, we have, as well as harm reduction supplies such as kind of clean needles and condoms and such, a healthy meal. We do advocacy through and have like a jumping off point for all of our other programming. We do housing support, health support. We have a nurse that comes in. We do art classes, which everybody loves. And we have
Okay. I couldn't hear the last few things you said. I don't know if you can hear me. Do you want to just finish that last thought, or?
Ms. Smith, you're on mute right now, but if you can just repeat the last kind of 10 seconds of what you're trying to say.
Me?
Yes, please.
Was there a question, because something went off in my internet connection?
Well, you were just finishing a thought, but it cut out like with about 10 seconds left.
Okay, so about the drop-in program?
Yeah.
So we do housing and health support. We have a donation room where everyone can access kind of new clothes, harm reduction supplies I mentioned, and art classes and workshops that connect people with other social service agencies in the city that can be supports and advocates for them, as well as taxes. We do a lot.
Okay, thank you. And how much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
You have 1 minute.
Okay, sorry, really quickly. Many of our witnesses so far have been describing, number one, we know that PSEPA is not enforced or in place equally across the country and in various provinces. It's been applied differently. Just if you could give some feedback. Again, I'll ask the Pierce Victoria Resources Society, but if there's time, someone else can jump in. The relationship between yourselves, those that you're serving, and local law authorities, the police, and any recommendations you have on how those relationships could be improved.
I can speak to that. We have a unique working relationship with the Vic PD that's very collaborative. They've agreed not to enforce PCPA in our community, which allows for a lot of safety for our sex workers. We have a police liaison program, which allows sex workers to safely interact with a police member who knows the community and understands stigma when they're reporting violence, instead of just going to the dispatch and getting whatever random officer there is. We would highly recommend a liaison officer for all communities.
Okay, thank you for that suggestion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Next, go to Ms. Dillon for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with Mrs. Clamen. Can you hear me? Okay. So my first question is, you spoke a little bit about New Zealand in your opening statement. I'm just very curious to know if reporting rates for human trafficking have gone up in New Zealand. We often say that if sex workers weren't afraid of being arrested, they would be more likely to report trafficking when they see it. So I just was wondering if you had a bit of knowledge about this situation in New Zealand since you brought it up in your testimony. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for the question. I can't speak specifically to the TIP report that's come out of New Zealand most recently and how it's being connected with trafficking. But I can say that since decriminalization was imported or implemented in New Zealand in 2003, sex workers have a lot more freedom to be able to report violence in the workplace and to be able to have some kind of recourse when they experience violence. And so we've heard stories, for example, of sex workers who've been able to officially, through courts or through tribunals, report sexual harassment from people working in their workplace or from bosses. And I remember one news piece of a sex worker who was successful in that case. We also know that sex workers are more able to work together in public space, which is really important. The interesting thing about New Zealand, and there's a ton of studies that have actually submitted to your Parliament Library, so that you can read them if you're interested. A lot of those studies actually demonstrate how much more safe sex workers are able to feel and how much more safety measures they're able to implement. So I think it's important to look to those studies. It's not a perfect model by any means, predominantly because migrant workers are still criminalized. And so that allows for a lot of anti-trafficking rhetoric and policy, and might impact on the way that those trafficking numbers look in a TIP report, because migrant sex workers are still not able, the immigration laws were not necessarily changed. And so in Canada, what we ask for along the removal of sex work criminal laws is the removal of the IRPR regulation that forbids or doesn't allow migrant sex workers to work in the sex industry. But there's a ton of research, peer-reviewed research, that I'd be very happy to send your way, and that, like I said, I've submitted to the Library of Parliament to be hopefully considered for the report that you produce.
Yes, please, if you can submit it to the committee. And I have a follow-up question. Can you please go into a bit more detail about how decriminalization or legalization would allow sex workers to ensure they have the protection of law enforcement and prevent trafficking as well as other crimes?
Sure. So we would most definitely not say that legalization would do that, because a legalized industry, we can, in a very loose way, just for comprehension, compare it to the way pot was legalized in Canada, or marijuana, was legalized in Canada, where the government actually controls the where, how, and when it can happen, which is most definitely not a decriminalized system. In a decriminalized system, sex workers would not have the threat of law enforcement or CBSA or other industries in their face all the time. We can't take for granted that law is an instruction to law enforcement and police officers and an invitation to be in the lives of sex workers all the time, whether they're claiming it's for protection or claiming it's for other reasons. They're invited into, and it's a non-invitation. It's not a sex workers aren't welcoming police into their lives. And so the removal of that makes a really big difference around how sex workers can organize their work. And the member groups in our alliance are always, as you just heard, both Maggie's and Piers are member groups of our alliance, and they've been speaking really eloquently to the safety mechanisms that sex workers can put in place without having to look behind their backs all the time. And that's not even to speak of all the safety mechanisms that clients who are criminalized in every context at every moment can put into place. So decriminalization really allows there to be a focus on work. And when there are instances of exploitation and violence which exist, we can recognize those for what they are. But when you paint the entire industry as violent, you're not able to actually address the violence that occurs, because everything is violent all the time. And so that goes unnoticed. And so in our view and our experience, what that would mean is that when there are instances of something that would meet the threshold of human trafficking, or that meets the threshold of other crimes against sex workers, other violence against sex workers, that would be more easily detectable, but also sex workers might eventually have more confidence in reporting to law enforcement. That relationship is historically filled with strife, mistrust, and abuse. And so that relationship takes time. And police, the way they apply the laws, are going to need to learn how to create those relationships. But in a decriminalized industry, there's at least the possibility for sex workers who want to access those systems to consider doing so. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And very quickly, you mentioned something about in your testimony, opening statement, you said PSEPA is not feminist.
Yeah.
And the thing is, sex workers are not necessarily just women. There's men as well, and LGBTQ community and non-binary. So we can't limit, I think, the terminology to just that feminism.
Our feminism isn't necessarily limited to only people who identify as women or you know, it's when we talk about feminism, at least in sex worker rights movement, we're talking about substantive equality, which goes beyond and across genders. Just to put that out there.
Okay. And
thank you, Ms. Dillon. You're out of time.
Sorry.
My apologies. Now, Mr. Fortin for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Ms. Clemen. To continue on the same topic, Ms. Clemen, could you please tell us about the impact of pandemic lockdowns over the course of the 2 years, the impact of that on sex work and on the sex work industry? Has it had an impact? Could you briefly summarize the situation? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to briefly summarize, but I'll do my best. Most definitely sex workers, like most people, were impacted by COVID. And if you can just consider that people who were already living quite marginalized and surveilled existences, that just was heightened in the context of COVID. And so what that meant for a lot of sex workers was when sex workers, because massage parlors were shut down and strip clubs were shut down, a lot of sex workers were out of work, and some, not all, and definitely not most, were able to move on into online work. But that kind of work is not accessible to a lot of sex workers because you have to have regular contact or access to technology. Most sex workers were not able to access the financial aid, the CERB, and we spent a lot of time, actually, our alliance, advocating wage, Maria Monsef in particular, to provide financial supports for sex workers, most of whom are living in poverty. But that was a really difficult thing to do. And so a lot of sex workers, what groups did was, and Maggie's was fantastic at this as well, Jenny can speak to it, is they did excellent mutual aid efforts, because at the end of the day, the government was not very helpful for sex workers living in a COVID context. Because that financial aid was not available to anybody making their money from a criminalized means. And so criminalization is one of, I mean, if you think beyond, and I think this committee really needs to do that, is to think beyond this notion of arrest and the harms of PCPA as arrest, because it goes beyond that. And if you think about criminalization as really impacting people's ability to access more mainstream supports or financial supports from the government, that's a really important thing that you all need to consider, is the lack of access that sex workers have to financial supports and medical and legal and social supports because of criminalization. So that's a tiny picture of that, if that helps a little bit.
We've been in a pandemic, there have been lockdowns, and you just said that this has made it such that most sex workers did not have income, were not able to work, and I understand that most of them were not eligible for the CERB or other government financial supports for those who were losing income during the pandemic. As a result, these sex workers experienced serious and immediate income losses. Question: as a result of this, were there changes to the types of services that were offered that normally workers would not have given certain services, or to certain clients? Did they change their services? I hope I'm clear here. Maybe you could speak to that. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Of course, sex workers change the kinds of services that were offered. Sex workers are very adaptable. A lot of the difference with COVID, as opposed to any other kind of situation where sex workers are stigmatized and not able to access health and safety supports, the difference is sex workers were also scared of COVID, the same way that a lot of other people were. So in this context, sex workers, quote unquote, behaved or proceeded with different cautions as well. But sex workers are very savvy, and people who need money will find ways to make money. And so sex workers change the kinds of services they offered. I saw some people offering video types of services. I saw one very savvy sex worker, but this was just one sex worker out of like over 10,000 that work across Canada, offer like a 2-week quarantine type service to spend that much time with the client. I don't know if it was, but some people only saw their regulars. But a lot of clients were in the context of COVID weren't necessarily as eager also because things can be traced back. So some sex workers sex work is transient. So some sex workers also had other types of work, and often sex workers do various types of work. That was something else that sex workers did as well. But I wouldn't argue that sex workers were offering services they wouldn't necessarily normally offer in the context of COVID, because sex workers' bodies are their working tool, and it's actually really important that sex workers take care of those. But obviously, when in financial distress, sex workers in COVID or non-COVID, sex workers might offer services that they wouldn't otherwise offer, in a similar way that some people take other jobs that they wouldn't necessarily do when in financial distress.
En résumé, parce qu'il ne doit pas nous rester beaucoup de temps.
We don't have much time left, Ms. Clement, but I was wondering, could you explain, in your opinion, should C-36 be abolished so that we should legalize prostitution, or should we keep it but improve some aspects to better protect sex workers?
No, there is nothing in PCPA that is protecting sex workers. I need to get that message across very clear, and it particularly needs to be abolished in its entirety, because the preamble is based on a fiction. It's based on a lie that sex work is exploitative, and that is not supported in any empirical evidence, nor has it been supported by the sex workers that have come to this committee before you, who represent thousands of sex workers. And so we would argue that there doesn't need to be specific sex work provisions in order to protect sex workers or address violence against sex workers, and there's a plethora of laws that already exist in the criminal code that can do that.
Thank you, Ms. Clement. Thank you, Mr. Fortin. Sorry. Over to you, Mr. Garrison, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do apologize if I have to turn off the video because of our bandwidth problems here, but we'll try it. So first of all, I want to thank Peers, an organization based in my riding, for all the work they do, but today, particularly for bringing directly the voices of sex workers to the committee. I think it was very important testimony, and I appreciate they've done that. I think they left out one of their functions, and I can testify to that, and that's education of elected officials about sex work in our community. So I first began to work with Peers more than a decade ago when I was a city councillor, and they spend a lot of their time trying to make sure people understand the reality of sex work. And I thank all the witnesses today for bringing that important perspective to the table. And I also thank Mr. Moore for asking so many questions of Peers in my riding. So let me turn back again to Ms. Clement, and the question that she was dealing with from Monsieur Fortin about the number of witnesses who come forward saying it's possible somehow to fix PSEPA. And I know you've just been very clear on that. But I think that we've also heard from sex workers that some pieces of PSEPA are particularly harmful and particularly dangerous. And I wonder whether you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, from our perspective, from the perspective of all of our member groups, all of PSEPA is actually very dangerous. But all of the regime itself actually hinges on the criminalization of clients. And I think it's important for people to see that, because people to understand how the law actually functions, regardless of what its intention was when it was written, it actually hinges on the criminalization of clients. And so the clients are considered violent and rapists at every single moment that a sex worker is seeing a client is an extremely problematic notion. And I don't think anybody would agree with that, including law enforcement. And so that whole framework that clients are abusive in every given moment and that sex workers are exploited all the time is a really problematic framework. So the entire PSEPA is based on that foundation. And so there's nothing in it that you could actually save. I mean, and that's not even speaking to the fact that it actually reproduces some of the laws that were struck down in the last constitutional challenge before the Supreme Court, namely the communication of one's own sexual services in public places, and some of the reproduction of pieces of it in some of the third-party laws. And so all of the regime itself is dangerous and actually just increases the risk of exploitation and violence in sex workers' lives.
We've had a number of witnesses talk about the recent decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal, but my understanding is there are other cases making their way through the courts, in particular a case that the Alliance has worked carefully on. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. It was one of our surprises to see you all meeting during our, we actually launched a constitutional challenge to all the sex work laws. There are 7 applicants. One of the main applicant is our Alliance, our 25 sex worker rights groups. And there's 5 individual sex workers and 1 third party who's to own an agency. We launched that constitutional challenge just last March, and we hope to be in court at the first level in June or July. Yeah, I mean, we're challenging the entire regime, and we're bringing forward a massive whack of evidence to demonstrate those harms. One of the problems with the most recent decision, the NS decision, is that it was really based on two hypotheticals regarding sex work cooperatives without considering all of the third-party relationships that are prohibited under PCPA and the co-op that they're actually ruled on. This notion of the co-op is actually a theoretical idea because it assumes that everybody is independent and that everybody's kicking in the same amount of money and everybody has the same share and that nobody exercises any influence over everybody and that nobody is concerned with profit. And that just simply doesn't exist. So while that decision was made in the Ontario Court of Appeal, what our case is doing is really explaining the different roles third parties play in the lives of sex workers. And they are various roles that aren't actually allowed with the existing criminal code provisions. We're not just talking about drivers and receptionists. We're talking about sex workers who really depend on third parties, who aren't entrepreneurs. And most sex workers aren't entrepreneurs and cannot be entrepreneurs. This idea that most sex workers are able to do that, or that the sex workers who want decriminalization are a small subset, is a complete myth and used by prohibitionists as a tactic.
Thank you. I want to ask a question again. I'm going to go back to something I know you've already ruled out, but and the whole bill. Of course, as you know, I've been a supporter of decriminalization for a very long time, so I agree with you on that. But one of the things you talked about is that the prohibitions on certain things that sex workers do don't require any element of exploitation. Can you say a bit more about? Because I think that's a very important point.
Right. So when you read the provisions, it doesn't actually say that exploitation needs to occur in order for a third party, for example, to be charged. Just the very relationship or earning a material benefit off the work that a sex worker does is considered a reason for arrest. And the exceptions to the exceptions don't actually leave room to address the actual relationships with that sex workers have with third parties. And so there is no actual it doesn't actually address violence. The only thing that addresses violence within the PCPA is the assumption that sex work is violence. And so all of the laws stem from that. And so there are laws that actually address violence, period, that we would appeal to in so far as the criminal code is a useful tool sometimes, that we would appeal to those laws to address violence in sex workers' lives. But we would definitely not say that the sex work laws actually address violence in sex workers' lives. They're just used as an extra tool that law enforcement has to be in the lives of sex workers, hoping as they scrounge around to find something.
Thank you, Ms.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Ms. Clement. Thank you, Mr. Garrison. I'll next go to our next round of questions. Mr. Morrison for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the panel today. A lot of experience here today, and I'm glad to see that. My question, I'm going to go to Maggie. Maggie's with the 35 years experience. We've heard throughout this the last few meetings we've had difference in policing, how some people are really quite happy and have a good relationship with local police, such as Vic PD that we heard from peers, but some places just do not. And I'm wondering, with your experience in Toronto, 35 years, if you could elaborate on what kind of relationship, and if maybe even further than that, help some of the police departments so that they maybe have a relationship like Vic PD.
Thank you so much for the question. So there's always going to be a turbulent relationship between police and sex workers as long as police are instructed to criminalize sex workers. And I want to emphasize that we shouldn't, that's really how it goes, that the sex workers on the ground experience violence, they experience harassment, especially racialized workers, especially trans and queer workers. And something that we saw during COVID-19 was that police were using the emergency orders to further target sex workers. And that's something that we always see. We always see how law enforcement uses other laws to surveil sex workers. So, for example, during the height of the pandemic, a service user reached out to us because someone who they thought was a client booked a session with them. That client showed up and it was actually a policeman who ticketed that sex worker for transgressing social distancing. So we actually had to amp up our legal support services to address this increase in policing. And we also saw how the emergency orders just facilitated more contact. So like I'm not here today to be like a proponent of police relationships, because under criminalization, it doesn't work. Under incarceration, under colonialism, that just doesn't work.
And maybe just another question, and I understand that, and I understand that it is difficult, especially in some areas like during COVID, if they're targeting, the people who you're trying to help. It's hard to imagine why they would do that. Where, I do know there are some probably good news stories, like not only Vic PD, but I think Ottawa, we had Ottawa Police in as well. And I think they have a really good relationship. I think it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort for the police to listen, to actually listen to what you have to say. Is there anything you could recommend to this committee that would further protect individuals in the sex trade, criminal code wise, that you would say this is what we actually could do, would like to see, something that could help guide us in the future?
Thank you for the follow-up question. I think it really needs to be understood that there's no possibility of improving this bill, that criminalization plus supports doesn't work, and that this bill doesn't facilitate access to supports. So it's not a matter of, adding anything additional onto this bill. It is a matter of repealing this bill and totally dismissing an approach that criminalizes sex workers, recognizing that it's just creating dangerous conditions for us.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just change that question. I didn't mean amendments. I meant new criminal code provisions that would protect the people who you are working with.
Well, we already have criminal code, like we already have legislation that exists around, like confinement, kidnapping, robbery. Those things already exist. What we really need is for this bill to be repealed. We need migrant workers to be able to work in sex work. We need, improvement with immigration laws. And we need sorry, go ahead.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Appreciate the answers.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Next, I can have Mr. Nakvi for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start with Ms. Duffy. You spoke about your organization's work with marginalized women, those who are Indigenous, Black, and women of color. Can you speak to the impact you have seen of this legislation on those women who are involved in sex work?
Thank you so much for that question. So I will say that Indigenous women, Black and racialized women, transgender migrant women, people living through poverty, they are overrepresented in street-based work. And Maggie's, we serve a lot of street-based workers, and this means that sex workers who face some of the highest level of marginalization with industry are unable to access security that working in more private and secure settings that would offer them. These workers are pushed into remote situations away from supports. And for Indigenous workers, their self-determination, their self-identification is completely undermined by this bill because their experiences are pushed into the singular narrative of human trafficking victims, which completely dismisses the social conditions, history of colonialism that makes sex work the best choice for many of these individuals, and that there's many reasons why these individuals come to sex work. So for racialized and Indigenous sex workers, this bill increases contact with police, it increases surveillance, it increases targeting, while also discouraging marginalized communities from being able to approach police and other social services for support.
So what changes would you suggest that we should be considering as we're reviewing this particular piece of legislation as it relates to marginalized women?
Well, as I've said before, this bill needs to be repealed. At previous meetings, I know there's witnesses who have said, and there's this misconception that, it's just the privileged few who want to see sex work decriminalized. But actually that's so false, because criminalization impacts marginalized workers so severely. They're the ones who are experiencing the brunt of discrimination and violence as a result of this law. So the best first step would be repealing this.
And so if the first step is repealing it, what's the second step in your view?
So second step would be to increase the supports for sex workers, especially marginalized workers, because there'll still be a stigma that will exist even after decriminalization, because there's a history of this. So we need supports, education for healthcare workers, legal support, social service sectors to support sex workers. We need funding for organizations like Peers Victoria, for Maggie's, for all the alliance groups who are working on the ground to provide really, really vital resources to generations who have experienced abuse and discrimination.
So one of the questions, and I'm asking you this, Ms. Duffy, but if Ms. Clement also wants to answer this question, is one of the questions that I've been asking is looking at other jurisdictions and try to see, is there a jurisdiction that you would point to that is doing a better job in terms of protecting sex workers, their health and social needs than Canada? And if so, what are they doing that's better than what's being done in Canada? Why don't we start with you, Ms. Duffy?
So I would point to jurisdictions like New Zealand, where they are decriminalized. I would not point to any jurisdictions that have a Nordic model like ours and tout this idea of partial decriminalization. It's either criminalization or it's decriminalization.
Ms. Clement, your thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I think Jenny did a great job of responding. The only thing I would add to it is that when sex work is not treated as a crime, when sex workers are not afraid of the impacts of criminalization, including but beyond arrest in their lives, then sex workers can start to think about having that safety and being able to have those, not have relationships criminalized, not have loss of family, loss of life, loss of income. The whole framework of sex work as a crime, wherever in the world that is implemented, really limits the capacity for sex workers' human rights to be protected. So the only place that we actually see that right now is in New Zealand and in parts of Australia.
Thank you, Ms. Clement. Next, I'll go for a round for 2.5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Varela et Madame Smith.
Ms. Chiavarella and Ms. Smith, maybe Ms. Smith first. Do you agree with Ms. Clement's position and her group's position, that is, that we should simply repeal C-36 and decriminalize prostitution? Or do you feel that we should perhaps improve working conditions for sex workers?
See the translation option on my screen?
Oh, in the bottom of your screen, there's a little heart interpretation. You have it?
Bottom of my screen, so if I go my
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que vous pouvez expliquer?
Mr. Speaker, could you please help our witness here?
Asked Mr. Clerk to...
It's at the bottom of your screen.
Of my screen where I have like the full grid of everybody?
Yes.
Peut-être Madame Clavarella à ce moment-là.
Maybe Ms. Chiavarella could answer, because I don't want to spend my 2 minutes on technical issues.
I think it is, or something?
Yes, so we are a member of the Alliance.
It's a globe.
And we...
The question is being answered. Can we mute, please?
We are a member of the Alliance with Jen Clemens and Maggie's, and we are fully in support of decriminalization. We don't believe that this law supports sex workers at all. We believe it harms sex workers, as Ms. Duffy and Ms. Clemens have made extremely clear. We don't believe that this law is salvageable in any way.
Et est-ce qu'il y a, à votre avis?
In your opinion, are there some measures that we should take and implement in order to help those who work in the sex work industry?
Is the best help for people in the sex industry, and a focus away from criminalization and more onto social services. And as Ms. Duffy explained, there are already provisions in the criminal code for robbery, for assault, for kidnapping, for any crimes that sex workers might experience. So we strongly believe that more attention should be spent away from criminalization and more on correcting social services and on combating systemic oppression, which is... Yeah.
Il nous reste pas beaucoup de temps.
I don't have much time remaining.
Out of time, I'm going to have to go to Mr. Garrison for 2.5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I want to ask a question about two pieces of statistics that have been often cited for the committee. And one is the Statistics Canada report that shows somehow the situation has improved under PSEPA, and the other are reports on traffic in New Zealand that purport to show that trafficking has increased. So, Ms. Clemens, would you comment on whether you believe that the reporting in these two reports actually reflects the reality that sex workers are experiencing?
I mean, I would have to take a really good look at the methodology of how those I'm not clear on what questions were asked in order to create that. And I encourage you all to have the same approach when you look at any statistics. One of the things, though, that I think we can suggest by understanding the way concepts are used is when you look at the concept of trafficking, it very often captures people who are Asian, who are migrant. You heard from Elaine Lam. You'll also hear from Alison Clancy from SWAN after this, who will explain to you how migrant workers get trapped up in definitions of human trafficking. And so if the statistics are demonstrating that the TIP report is suggesting an increase, that might be because migrant workers aren't allowed to work. That would just be my hypothesis. In terms of, there was a second part of that I wanted to respond to. In terms of the arrests that are being made, I think the committee needs to understand, I don't know where the statistics were collected from and in what ways. It doesn't necessarily represent the number of people who've come into contact with law enforcement or the people, I think it only represents the convictions. So you can imagine that there's a lot of people that get arrested all the time, that get thrown into jail, and then maybe the charges don't stick, but police really use whatever they have in their arsenal, and they use those sex work laws often. But the impacts of PCPA, again, go well beyond arrest. And the impacts that has on sex workers' lives in terms of housing, child apprehension, violence, inability to have or maintain income. So what that report doesn't capture are all of the impacts of PCPA. They might capture the actual arrests or conviction rates, but it doesn't capture what the impacts are of the law.
And 30 seconds left. There's not really time for another full question. But so I just want to say once again how much I really appreciate the testimony from all three sets of witnesses today in bringing the voices of sex workers and the actual experience to the committee. So thank you once again.
Similarly, I want to thank all the witnesses that have come today for this first round, and I'm going to say thank you to you, and I will suspend for a minute and ask if you guys, the witnesses that have already spoken, to come off the camera, and then we'll do a quick sound check for the witnesses that are going to be speaking in the next round. I have quick cue cards, so if you're running out of the last 30 seconds, I'll raise the yellow card and the red card when you're done. You'll have 5 minutes to speak on behalf of your organization, and then subsequently, after all three organizations have spoken, we'll have rounds of questions in which you'll be able to elaborate more so on your questions. I have Mr. Fortin's hand up. If you have a question.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais simplement porter si on pouvait porter parce que tantôt j'ai perdu. Je vous en fais pas le reproche là.
So earlier, apparently there's some feedback on the line. I just want to make sure that the witnesses have access to the interpretation. I just wanted to mention it earlier. My questions are always posed in French, and I want to ensure that the witnesses have access to the interpretation and that we're not wasting any time for nothing. There's already some time lost due to the interpretation, so let's try to keep that to a minimum.
Ms. Clancy, Ms. Lindstrom, Ms. Jay, do you all have your interpretation set to the language of your choice?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I do. Thank you.
And Ms. Clancy, you do too? Perfect. Thank you. So I will begin by, as an individual, I think Ms. Stevenson for 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me here today. We know it is imperative to hear directly from survivors and those involved in the commercial sex industry. I want to highlight that hearing from people who are, were, or ended up as unwilling bodies in the industry is far more difficult, not because there are fewer of us, but because we are less likely to have freedom to speak out for reasons ranging from shame to fear to death. As I am able to share today, I don't want to just tell you my story. I want you to walk through it with me. I was 20 years old when I first engaged in commercial sex, and I would have been considered a consenting adult. But I did not just appear on this earth at 20, so it's critical to take a moment to understand who that 20-year-old was. I was a precocious child advocate. At age 11, I started the first Oakville chapter of what was then a small organization called Free the Children, later to be known as We Charity. I was considered bright, gifted, and full of potential. And then at 13, I was sexually assaulted, which continued for the next 5 years. My life went from collecting signatures for a petition destined for the federal government to ambivalence and drug use. Despite that shift, my grades never slipped and I remained engaged in other after-school activities. I buried my trauma, and even once a police investigation was sparked, the detective on the case referred to me as put together and the strong one who held the others up. The first time I used my body to make money, it was a desperate attempt to regain ownership of my sexuality. I vehemently pushed back when anyone questioned my choices. My body, my choice, is what I told them. I maintained my managerial job throughout the day, smiling at customers and running 2 locations of a business. At night, I partied, occasionally engaging in commercial sex for fun and extra cash for my boyfriend and me. I believed my boyfriend and I to be partners, but this illusion was shattered the first time I refused to perform a particular act, or attempted to refuse. In the blink of an eye, I went from being an empowered woman to a victim. With that shift, you might think that I was immediately resistant to the work or even reached out for help. I didn't. My boyfriend was violent, and my fear of him stole my voice. Due to my inability to exit the world in which I existed, I suffered from cognitive dissonance. To relieve this discomfort, I doubled down on proclaiming loudly how much I enjoyed my lifestyle. This time, however, I was not only convincing others, I was also convincing myself. It wasn't until I nearly lost my life at the hands of my boyfriend that I fled. Over the next 10 years, I earned several degrees in the helping and criminal justice field. I worked in shelters with males in conflict with the law and with the Victim Witness Assistance Program. Regardless of this gained knowledge and experience, I never believed my experience to be anything other than domestic violence and poor choices on my part. It wasn't until a new friend, hearing my story for the first time, suggested to me that I was exploited, that I looked at my involvement in a new light. I may have walked into the commercial sex industry a consenting adult, but by the time I ran out, it was as a victim of trafficking, condemned to a lifetime of complex post-traumatic stress. I am begging you to please end the narrative that these two are not connected. It is impossible to ascertain that only willing bodies are working in the commercial sex industry. Some people are unable to identify their experience as exploitation. Some people are terrified of being deported, repercussions from their boyfriends, bosses, or pimps. Some workers may have chosen their work, but they chose it because they were desperate or in survival mode, and a choice made in desperation is no choice at all. As ideological as it might be to draw a line around consensual sex workers and suggest that PSEPA must be repealed to keep them safe, it is unrealistic. The decriminalization of sex work will result in collateral damage that looks like an entire population for whom a lifetime of complex trauma will be the cost of living in Canada. I must ask, who is it that you deem worthy to fulfill this population? Because let me remind you, it can be anyone. If folks truly want safety, harm reduction, and the prevention of exploitation of unwilling bodies, then the next step is not decriminalization. It is working together to pour resources into mental health issues, trauma prevention education, financial disparities, the severely inflated cost of post-secondary education, reconciliation and healing with Indigenous communities, and of course, gender equality. Until these foundational chasms are considered repaired, we simply cannot open the doors to an industry that preys on and exploits these and other vulnerabilities. If a world exists in which the sex industry can prevail without extreme levels of inequality, exploitation, and predation, we must first work together to create it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stevenson. I'll next go to Suzanne Jay of the Asian Women for Equality.
Thank you. So thank you for the invitation to present today. I'm here on behalf of Asian Women for Equality. Members of our group have lived experience of being in prostitution, and our members also have many years of working in the front line of supporting women. One of our goals is to advance sex, race, and economic equality for women in Canada. So these rights are promised to us by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This promise is plainly referenced in the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And these rights are especially important to women who are racialized and colonized. The sex industry is not a homogenous group. There are the exploiters and there are the exploited. The exploiter side is comprised of sex buyers, pimps, and the media platforms that support the sex buyers and pimps to connect with each other. These people are overwhelmingly men, and they have a vested parasitic interest in growing prostitution as an industry. For these people, the sex industry is safe and it's lucrative. And then we have the exploited. The vast majority of women who are in prostitution would leave if they had any other way to support themselves and their families. Asian-themed massage parlors operate in every major Canadian town. The women in these venues are tremendously vulnerable to rape and other violence from sex buyers and pimps. And in fact, it is their job to give men a racist sexual experience. Now I'm going to tell you why we think the Act is valuable. We support the Act. The Act is sophisticated. It recognizes the differences between the exploiters and the exploited, and it treats them differently. The exploiters are criminalized and the exploited are not. The Act is the only law that targets the sex buyer. You might hear opinions that human trafficking law is enough, but that law only focuses on the traffickers. Human trafficking law gives a free pass to the man who buys sex from a trafficked woman. The advertising platforms that helped him find her also get a free pass. The act is valuable because it criminalizes the advertising of prostitution. It empowers police to interrupt the internet platforms that package, brand, and market prostitution. And these platforms are crucial to growing the customer base for the sex industry and for normalizing sex buying. It is $1 billion industry to make racism and inequality sexy. I'm going to move on to our recommendations. We recommend to strike Section 213 of the Act. It criminalizes women when they're prostituted close to a school, a playground, or daycare, and we argued against this section in 2014. And we're telling you again, keep your focus on the exploiters and stop punishing women for being exploited in public view. Expunge the criminal records of women charged or convicted of prostitution under the old laws. This was a mistake that leaves women permanently criminalized. We want you to show political will and leadership to enforce the law. When our justice system interferes with prostitution, it also disrupts human trafficking, drug trafficking, and money laundering, and other organized crime. We're not a law and order organization, but we still want you to make Canada less welcoming to organized crime, whether it be Asian, European, or homegrown criminal gangs. We want you to we advise to grant trafficked women permanent resident status. This move will diminish the power that pimps and traffickers have over women because it gives women the same legal protections and entitlements that are enjoyed by the exploiters. Now, a weakness of the Act is that it's trying to address inequality through criminal law. And there needs to be a bigger picture approach for women to successfully exit prostitution and also to avoid recruitment altogether. We recommend making the social safety net stronger, and to do this by providing everyone with a guaranteed livable income, otherwise known as a basic income. This would make a life-changing difference for millions of women. The Act is the only tool that allows Canada to stop sex buyers. It is one of the only tools that allows police to interfere with sex trafficking. It is the only tool that we have to prevent internet platforms from exponentially increasing the number of men who are pimps and sex buyers. So if you strike down this act or repeal this act, pimps and sex buyers will have free rein to exploit and traffic. Striking down this act will intensify racism and sexism that's directed at all women because they are inherent to prostitution. And this will move us further away from the equality that women are promised by the Charter.
Thank you, Ms. Jay. Next, if I can have Amber Lindstrom from Safe Sex London for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Amber Lindstrom, and I'm Program Coordinator and Peer Support Worker at Safe Space London, a collective by, with, and for sex workers, allies, women, and non-binary folks in London, Ontario that's been operating since 2009. Many of our community members experience intersectional marginalization, including street-based sex workers, Indigenous, racialized, trans, and queer sex workers experiencing housing instability or homelessness, and sex workers who use substances. In London, there is an entrenched anti-sex work lobby pervading social services, law enforcement, and politics. London is an example of what happens when PASEPA is enforced. The experiences by our community within this criminalized environment show that not only does PASEPA not protect sex workers, but it actively harms us. PASEPA hasn't reduced demand for sexual services in our area. However, it has forced sex work further underground, leaving no time for street-based workers to talk to the client about condom use, payment, or location of services ahead of time, because both client and worker are rushed due to fear of legal interference. It results in increased violence because workers now have to work alone in secluded places and clients' cars due to the criminalization of their work. We have heard repeated stories of workers being driven to the outskirts of the city to evade police, only to be assaulted and left stranded. Sex workers deserve safe working conditions, and criminalizing any aspect of our work takes away that security. As one sex worker accessing the space wanted to share with you today, it's real work. If it was decriminalized, we could have safe places for workers to work, and we would be able to charge higher wages. Like the workers on the street right now, with how it is, we can't with how it is right now. Under PASEPA, government funding has also been given predominantly to anti-sex work organizations. This results in folks who actively engage in sex work not being allowed in many shelters and facing barriers to accessing community resources. This is something we see frequently in London. Unless sex workers conform and say they're exploited or trafficked and willing to leave sex work, they are not allowed to access some shelters and programs. As one sex worker who accesses said, "We're kind of actually considered a plague, okay, to other shelters." They'd say, "No, you do not fit the criteria for an abused woman. You're a working girl. You're not allowed in here." And I thought, well, where the hell am I supposed to go? End quote. This narrative that you do not fit is a symptom of the stigmatizing, criminalized environment of PASEPA. Sex workers experiencing stigma and barriers when accessing healthcare, and so sex workers in London also experience stigma and barriers when accessing healthcare and social services. We see medical staff refusing street-based sex workers adequate treatment and sex workers being flagged in social work systems. The stigma perpetuated by PASEPA also magnifies the harms done to workers who are members of already marginalized communities. At Safe Space, we offer services like peer support, harm reduction services, and system navigation to help address the systemic harms of this law, but we do not have the resources available to us to provide the full scope of support needed when harm, surveillance, and stigma are being perpetrated at all levels of care in society by the directives of PASEPA. It is not safe for people who do sex work to report to police under PASEPA. Instead, workers create our own in-community bad date reporting systems. At Safe Space, that includes a bad date reporting line and a bad date information flyer. We experience ongoing reports of police harassment, assault, and that when workers attempt to report incidents, police have instead found a way to charge them using PASEPA, like through blocking traffic charges, third-party charges, or saying they're working in an illegal area. PASEPA also magnifies systemic racism at the hands of police. As one Indigenous sex worker wanted us to share about the law, they don't care about us. Like, we're people too. There are like 6 or 8 Indigenous workers missing right now in London, and they don't care. I don't see posters. I don't see posts. I don't see police combing, end quote. This is a problem of systemic marginalization by PASEPA. More police training will not help. The police are guided by PASEPA to criminalize and eliminate sex work, an undeniable facet of which is the elimination of us as sex workers. If you want sex workers to have a better relationship with the legal system, the first step will always be full decriminalization of sex work. PASEPA claims to protect the dignity and equality of all Canadians. However, it perpetrates real harms against the people it claims to help by surrounding sex work with criminal consequences and conflating trafficking with sex work. PASEPA gives society the message that the government wants us eradicated, that sex workers and our jobs are affronts to society. Sex workers are not a threat to your communities. We are members of your community. PASEPA does not encourage sex workers to leave sex work. Instead, it gives us the message, stop and obey, or we will make this so difficult and dangerous that you die. And that has been happening. This law has been marginalizing and killing us. Sex workers are impacted by this law every day, and it's essential that our voices and perspectives are centered in this discussion. We are asking you to fully repeal PASEPA and decriminalize sex work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lindstrom. Now I'll go over to Swan Vancouver Society. Alison Clancy, thanks for coming back. I think last time we had some technical issues. We couldn't have you, so 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Alison Clancy, and I am the Executive Director of Swan Vancouver. For the past 20 years, Swan has supported newcomer, migrant, and immigrant women who do indoor sex work. Swan is a member of the Global Alliance Against Traffic in Women, an alliance of more than 80 organizations from around the world working to end trafficking. As such, Swan is deeply familiar with both sex work and trafficking. I would like to begin by addressing the idea of keeping PASEPA but improving police training as a way to address the complex issues before the committee. For 10 years, I have trained police on sex work and human trafficking. I have worked with police on sex work and trafficking investigations and related police policy and practice, but I no longer do this work for 2 reasons. Firstly, police training is futile in a criminalized legal framework. The police enforce the criminal code. PASEPA is part of the criminal code, meaning the police role is fundamentally at odds with ensuring sex workers' safety. Secondly, the police have severe and well-documented systemic racism issues. Until these issues are resolved, any PASEPA-related training is futile. In fact, until we admit that racial profiling sits at the heart of PCEPA criminalization of immigrant and migrant sex workers. And until we can have an explicit conversation about that, no amount of police training can make a difference. Society now understands that an increased police presence in the lives of racialized individuals is deeply problematic. One example being mental health checks, another being street checks. Thus, it is confounding and downright dangerous that carceral feminists suggest that a police presence in the lives of racialized sex workers via increased PCEPA enforcement is acceptable. Now to address anti-trafficking. In the 2014 hearings, trafficking took center stage. Here it is again, dominating the discussion. Apparently, Canada can still not have an evidence-based conversation about the sex industry. This is due to the incessant trafficking rhetoric. At these hearings, we have had testimonies framed as an ideological divide, as if to suggest there are two equally weighted perspectives. Let us be clear. This is simply an effort to distract from a vital discussion. Sex workers have unequivocally outlined the impacts of PCEPA on their lives. Sex workers have presented empirical evidence of PCEPA's harms. Sex workers are once again fighting constitutional challenges in the court. This on top of the unanimous Supreme Court decision in Bedford, which established that criminalizing sex work is dangerous. What more will it take to repeal PCEPA? Yet, a shaming morality masked as anti-trafficking protection and supported by disinformation that has been debunked time and time again is still being given equal weight. I can offer concrete examples of this in the question period. And what does trafficking disinformation mean for real progress on the issues before us? It means in Canada, we cannot move forward with a labor-centered dialogue on sex work. It means anti-sex work perspectives which fuel the stigma that kills are given a national platform. Trafficking is an issue that needs to be addressed, but you do not have to jeopardize sex workers' lives through PCEPA to address it. At SWAN, upholding sex workers' rights and addressing trafficking are not mutually exclusive. PCEPA criminalization not only inflicts harms on immigrant and migrant sex workers, but also on those who are trafficked. Immigrant and migrant sex workers experience multi-layered criminalization via municipal bylaws, PCEPA, anti-trafficking enforcement, and the immigration prohibition on sex work. PCEPA is often the entry point for police into immigrant and migrant sex workers' lives via investigating clients, neighbors reporting sex work activity, and for other reasons. With PCEPA as the gateway, the women SWAN serves have only ever seen two outcomes after the initial PCEPA-related interaction with police. The woman herself becomes the target of an anti-trafficking investigation, or she is arrested, detained, and deported. Repeatedly, women have told SWAN that they fear police more than predators. This means that women do not report violence. PCEPA has been a gift to predators and traffickers. PCEPA criminalization not only puts immigrant and migrant sex workers lives at risk, in no way does it support racialized women in the sex industry who are trafficked either. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy. I'll now go to questions, beginning with Mr. Brock for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, lady, your participation this afternoon. You all have presented some very passionate arguments that will assist this committee in this very important study. I'd like to, with the time that I have permitting, I'd like to ask a number of questions, starting with you, Ms. Stevenson. And I must say, Ms. Stevenson, your story is a powerful story, and I'm glad that you started the preamble by asking us to walk with you and recounting your life journey. For someone who has spent 30 years in law, and in particular the last 18 as a Crown prosecutor, dealing with similar victims such as yourself, it is quite reassuring to me to hear from you that you have found your voice, that you have not just been patronized by the police for your strength that you exemplified during the prosecution, but you are now not only a survivor, but you're also an advocate. So you should be very much congratulated for that. And I'm very proud of you for your attendance today and what you have to share. The gist that I got from listening to you very carefully is that part of your strategy is all about educating the public. And I'd like to hear from you specifically on your ideas with respect to those who propose repealing Bill C-36 and those such as yourself and others that you've heard today who feel that this is a very important piece of balanced legislation. So how does education fit within that equation?
Thank you for all of your kind words. And I would love to speak to that. My area of focus is in prevention education. And I think we need to highlight the importance of widespread education, not just for police, not just for certain areas, but for entire communities. I think anyone who truly wants harm reduction cannot deny the integral helpfulness of this widespread education. More education means less victimization. More education means more overall comprehension of repercussions from the industry. More education means interrupting the commercial sex industry at all points of engagement, from the buyer, the third-party profiteer, if there is one, and the seller. It is imperative that we recognize that widespread education not only helps prevent the victimization and exploitation of unwilling bodies, but it also helps prevent the creation of exploiters and of traffickers and of buyers. A nonprofit that I co-founded in Wyoming did some sting operations with law enforcement there, and they actually were able to talk to buyers at the time of arrest about why they're purchasing sex, and each one of them spoke about missing something in their life. I think this points to us needing to invest in boys and men and make sure that we're understanding that they're able to access education on how to handle emotions, how to communicate properly, how to access therapy when they need it. And that way they're not seeking out the purchase of another human body to fill a void that they don't know how to properly fill. Thank you.
You heard from a witness this afternoon, Ms. Clancy, speak to issues such as police training is futile, her words. The police work is at odds with the sex worker safety. Do you agree with that statement? And if you do not agree with that statement, please explain why.
I don't agree with that statement. I believe that police officers deserve to have a complete understanding of the mental, emotional, psychological, and cognitive processes of the people that they will be offering aid to. I totally hear and understand, and I've heard from people in the industry who say that they are at odds with police. And I think that comes from, this education needs to be starting well before someone enters becoming a police officer. So we're having it in all public schools everywhere. So we have an understanding of exploitation, of healthy relationships, of consent, and all of that. But then once someone enters officer training, they need to have a deeper understanding of those things I pointed out, the emotional, the cognitive, the psychological effects, and why someone might enter this work and what kind of help they might need should they ask for help, and what resources you can provide them if what they're looking for is not direct help. This way we can create a foundation where people who are in the sex industry and officers can find a way to coexist and work together and help each other.
If I can stop you right there, I've got a few seconds left to ask one further question. In your prepared speech, you talked briefly about the impact of decriminalization of this particular industry. And I want to bring to your attention a previous witness statement on that particular issue. Her name was Kathy Peters. She testified February the 11th, 2022. She indicates that if that were to happen, this country, Canada, would become a global sex tourism designation and America's brothel. Indigenous women and girls will be the first casualties. Do you agree with that statement? And if so, why?
I think it's fair to say if you take barriers down, if there's barriers in one area, say in the US, to accessing, and you don't have barriers. In Canada, people are going to go where there's less barriers to access what they're looking for, which is the purchase of sex. Decriminalization is a short-term solution to help sex workers now, but it is not a long-term solution to keep our communities safe.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you
Stevenson.
so much, Ms. Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr.
Stay
Brock.
strong.
Next, I'll go over for 6 minutes to Ms. Briard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank all our witnesses for being with us this afternoon. Ma première question s'adresse à ma...
My first question is for Ms. Lindstrom. Your organization would like sex work to be decriminalized, and you have also referred to municipal bylaws about the safety of sex workers. Could you please provide more detail, more information about the impacts of municipal bylaws? Also, if you could talk to us about the police, please. If it was decriminalized, would sex workers feel more comfortable reporting incidents of violence or trafficking which occur? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. In terms of our local experiences with like local laws and bylaws, we encounter a lot of difficulties as sex workers. We, at one point, the police tried to start publishing the names of clients that were caught and arrested, which seriously endangered and impacted us as sex workers, because if clients think their names might be published, they don't feel comfortable providing us with their real names when we're seeking to like vet them and make sure they're safe clients in those initial discussions. And we had to like protest that, and it was a difficult process. We also saw during COVID, our strip clubs were closed much earlier than like other clubs were, which pushed sex workers working in strip clubs to find other avenues of sex work. Workers in our community were also heavily impacted by COVID bylaws, and the police heavily enforced those on the sex workers in our community, including things like when the curfews were in place, like not being traveling to one place or another after 8 p.m. and stuff. We actually had street-based sex workers who weren't able to access our services because police would stop them if they were out walking to and from their home or the place that they were sleeping outside to access us. In terms of decriminalization, we really support it at Safe Space London, because we really see the impacts of this law locally in terms of our relationships with the police, because the police here do support and work through a PSEPA context. We cannot improve our relationships with police until decriminalization happens, because as long as there is criminalization, the police will be working through that lens of focusing on sex workers and our job. So right now, like we can't go report to police. As a peer support worker, when somebody comes up to me and gives a bad date report, I always do offer to them, would you like to report to police? I'll go to the police station with you. And even when offered peer support, they still do not feel comfortable going. Like that is the extent to which we do not feel safe. We keep hearing a narrative of training the police will help, but it cannot take place until decriminalization happens, because the police can't be educated to support us until they are no longer working to eradicate us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maintenant, j'aimerais...
Now, a question for Ms. Clancy. In your opinion, what modifications and amendments should be made to PSEPA in order to better protect sex workers, and also at the same time to fight human trafficking?
Thank you for the question. PSEPA needs to be repealed in its entirety. There are no amendments that can be made to protect sex workers. As I stated previously, PSEPA, for the population of sex workers that we work with, newcomer, migrant, and immigrant women, it works as the gateway and the entry point into the multi-layered criminalization. Police through PSEPA work in a tag team approach, either with municipal bylaw officers or Canada Border Services. So if sex work is to be made safer, it cannot be done through PSEPA, and it has to be repealed in its entirety.
Ouais, je comprends, puis j'avais bien...
I understand. I understand, and we did hear your original statement in which you said that, but if we fully repeal the bill, well then what can we do to fight trafficking? We've heard in different witness testimonies about the sex work industry and also trafficking, which are not the same. There are many distinctions between the two. So what's your view?
Yeah, so there are already a multitude of laws in the Criminal Code of Canada that can be enforced to prevent trafficking from happening or to address the situation from evolving into a full-blown trafficking situation. So, for example, if a woman is being assaulted or exploited, there are already criminal codes offenses in the criminal code if those are enforced, and perhaps she can remove herself or seek the justice that she requires before a situation turns into a trafficking situation. And there are also trafficking laws in the criminal code as well.
Merci. Et ma dernière question.
Thank you. My final question is for Ms. Stevenson. Thank you very much for your very touching testimony.
Your time is up.
Sorry. Thank you.
I'll go over to Mr. Fortin for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Ms. Stevenson. Ms. Stevenson, during your remarks, you said that we should draw a distinction between prostitution and trafficking. No one could disagree with that. But when you say that, it leads me to understand that prostitution is something that is fine and should be supported and made safe. But trafficking should be criminalized. And you say that you support C-36 and don't think it should be repealed. Could you explain a little bit more about your stance on that? C-36 seeks to criminalize the purchase of prostitution services, and some say that it harms sex workers. What is your stance on this? Do you feel that we should repeal C-36 or should we keep it? And if you feel that we should keep C-36, then could you please tell us what improvements we could bring to it?
Thank you for your question. I just wanted to clarify, and it might have been because I had a hard time hearing the translation, but in my original statement, I was trying to suggest that we have to stop saying that sex work and trafficking are completely separate issues. As far as I'm concerned, they are deeply connected, and that was my experience.
Okay.
To answer your question about Bill C-36, I think we need to keep it. I think that repealing or decriminalization, I briefly touched on this, but I think it would help the current workers. We keep hearing that sex workers are marginalized and in survival mode, and for multiple reasons, unable to move beyond that survival mode. Decriminalization would certainly help these workers move within their survival mode more freely, but it would be unlikely to provide resources to give these workers a leg up and get out of that survival mode. As far as I'm concerned, widespread resources and education to prevent people from existing in a survival mode that results in the sale of their own bodies is the best way to create foundational change. Decriminalization and repealing PSEPA, as I said, would certainly result in those short-term benefits, but the long-term detriments of more people being exploited due to increased demand and the overall continued lack of resources that results in the sale and commodification of human bodies would be a continued issue. So we need to keep PSEPA and work together to provide resources so we don't see people working the streets and in survival mode doing that.
Merci, Madame Stevenson.
Thank you, Ms. Stevenson. Ms. J, a question for you. You gave some recommendations some recommendations for improving the provisions of C36. Here's what I would like to know. In fact, did you have a brief or a document, a written document with your recommendations?
Je vois plus Madame J. Je sais pas si elle...
I don't see Ms. J. Is she still in the meeting?
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que Madame...
Mr. Chair, is Ms. J. still in the meeting? I don't know if she's still here.
Okay.
Yeah, I am here, but I can't hear I'm on the English translation channel, but I can't hear the translator. It's incredibly difficult to hear anything that she's saying.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais qu'on suspende.
Mr. Chair, could we suspend in order to check what's happening with translation?
While we get the interpretation tested. And Mr. Fortin, you have about 2.5 minutes left.
Ouais, 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes. Well, so I've lost about half of my 6 minutes due to interpretation issues, and I'm not so happy about that. Ms. J, can you hear me?
Ask away, Mr. Fortin. We'll make it work.
Okay. Madame J.
Ms. J, here's what I would like to know. Actually, is interpretation working, or am I speaking into the void? Yes? Okay. Ms. J, you told us about recommendations that you have to improve C36. Here's my question. Did you send in a written brief, or do you have a written document with these recommendations of yours to improve C36?
Yes, we sent in a very brief brief. We were advised that you would have trouble with getting translation done on the documents in time.
Monsieur le Président, on va pouvoir avoir ce document.
Mr. Chair, will we have that document in both languages?
Yes, we will, of course. Both official languages.
Okay. Et pouvez-vous, Madame J.
Ms. J, my time is running out, but could you quickly explain something about your recommendations? Do you feel that C36, we should keep it? Does it protect sex workers and victims of exploitation, both of them? But some witnesses are saying that the bill is harmful because it makes sex workers hesitant to bring forward complaints. So should we decriminalize?
We have such little time. I would say before we move ahead, that we need to verify what we mean by sex worker. If there's a sleight of hand that's happening, where sex workers are, the term sex worker is being defined to include, you're being tricked into believing that sex worker includes the people who are pimping, managing brothels, doing recruitment, and facilitating through advertising. So if you do ask the question of what do you mean when you say sex worker?
Prostitutes, I mean. I'm referring to the person who is selling his or her body. How can we protect this person without advantaging, for example, traffickers?
Well, I think enforcement is the missing piece here. The police are not enforcing, the crowns are not pressing charges. The question is, if the act does not cause harm to exploited people. Where there's harm to women, it's because of the lack of enforcement. The refusal of the police to enforce the law leaves women at the mercy of the pimps and the sex buyers, who get to be as controlling and as violent as they want. It really does harm women to know that they are deemed not worthy of protection, even when the law of the country says that what is happening to them is wrong. and it harms all of the women in the community. It harms all of the women in the community when we see that other women are being sold, denigrated, and hurt, and nothing happens to the man or the men who caused that harm. And women didn't go to the police before the law, and they don't go now because the police have not changed their attitudes or their behavior about the sex buyers. Before the act, the police arrested women almost exclusively. And after the act, in BC, in Vancouver especially, the police stopped arresting anybody. They have effectively disappeared prostitution because they have no numbers, no arrests, no cases.
Thank you, Mr. Fortin. I have been generous with the time. Hopefully, I've been able to make up the time you might have lost.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll go over to Mr. Moore for 5 minutes. Mr. Garrison for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to go back to Ms. Clancy's opening remarks where she said that she had some important information about misinformation being used in the arguments about trafficking. And I'd like to give her a chance to talk about those examples that she mentioned.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Garrison. And I'd first like to start by commending you for respectfully listening to all of the witnesses throughout the hearings, and to just acknowledge that at every opportunity that you had, you brought this discussion back to the issue at hand, and while it was being conflated with so many issues. So I'd like to thank you for that. So back to the trafficking disinformation that's been presented before this committee. Quite frankly, I have found these hearings to be a national embarrassment. I'm deeply disturbed by the amount of trafficking disinformation that has been put forward and uncritically consumed. So in the 2014 hearings, this happened. And I expected that when the committee members came to this hearing 8 years later, that they would have been aware of the types of misinformation that would have been put forward. So I will just name a few now. Ms. Clamon earlier talked about the age of entry into the sex trade was 12 to 14 years old. In my brief, I included the Washington Post investigative report, the Atlantic investigative report, to show how that has been debunked time and time again. Within Canada, the Canadian Women's Foundation as well has retracted that claim, and not only that claim, but all of their trafficking task force so-called research that has so harmfully informed so much trafficking policy and dialogue in Canada. So if the members are interested why the Canadian Women's Foundation reports on trafficking are no longer available on their website, I really encourage the members to connect with the Canadian Women's Foundation. I'll also address one other piece of disinformation that I heard during the hearings, and that was the claim that there's an uptick of human trafficking along with sporting events. I believe the Stampede was mentioned. This also happened in Vancouver around the 2010 Olympics. There was a lot of fear-mongering by groups that traffickers were going to be bringing young girls into the country, bringing young girls into Vancouver. That did not materialize. The Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women have published empirical evidence that this does not happen. It does not happen around the Super Bowl either. And I will guarantee you that Vancouver right now has a bid or is considering a bid again for the Olympics. If Vancouver should be successful in its bid, this myth about the uptake of human trafficking around the Olympics will surely come around one more time, despite it not having materialized last time.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy, and thank you for your kind words at the beginning. A phenomenon I've been observing in these hearings is there tends to be some kind of presumption that PSEPA has somehow reduced the frequency of sex work. And I think most of us would say that there has been no evidence of that presented. And instead, what this committee is focusing on is the real impacts of PSEPA, which is in making sex work increasingly more dangerous. So I wonder how you feel about that argument that PSEPA has somehow reduced the frequency of sex work.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'd like to address the end demand aim of PSEPA. It's preposterous for Canada to think that Canada is going to do something that no society or any other country has ever done in the history of the world, and that is to end sex work. If the government is interested in ending demand, you don't take away the purchasers of sex. You look at poverty, you look at the gender wage gap, you look at the housing crisis, you look at systemic racism, and all of those factors that are the push factors into the sex industry for some folks who it is a last resort and it's the last thing that they want to be doing. So this continued conversation about ending demand via criminalizing the purchasers of sex is a colossal waste of money, a colossal waste of resources. And it's just a cover for the moral opposition to the sex industry. That is not how you protect sex workers. It will never work in Canada, and it has never worked anywhere.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy. Just very briefly, I know we have very little time. I want to go back to Ms. Lindstrom and her remark that PSEPA makes it more difficult for those involved in sex work to address services available to others in the community.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Absolutely, 100%. One of the main programs at Safe Space that we offer is system navigation, and we're constantly coming up against walls where sex workers are not allowed access to other services, especially in terms of organizations that received a lot of funding through PSEPA. They will not allow sex workers who choose to continue to stay in sex work access, and this has like horrible ramifications in our community, especially for street-based sex workers. Many who access Safe Space are also experiencing homelessness.
Thank you, Ms. Lindstrom. Sorry about cutting you off. In interest of time, I'm going to ask Mr. Moore if he would be okay to doing 2.5 minutes, as well as Ms. Diab, just for the interest of time. We just have a quick committee business at the end. If Mr. Moore, you'd be amicable to that?
Not really. I thought I had 5 minutes, Mr. Chair.
You do have 5 minutes, but I'm just, it's 5 to 3, and in interest of time of just getting both of you, I can extend it by 5 minutes if that's okay, if the will of the committee.
All right, well, I'll try and ask my question quickly here. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses. I do have some quick questions. I thought, Ms. Jay, you summed it up very nicely. I see you there. The response of Bill C-36 to the Bedford decision, you summed it up by saying exploiters are criminalized, and we do believe that this is exploitative. We heard from Ms. Stevenson about the predation, about exploiting and exploiters. So you summed it up by saying the exploiters are criminalized and the exploited are not criminalized. And I think that it should be something that a goal that we all share. Can you expand on that? You summed it up nicely, but if you could expand on that a bit about how PSEPA works.
Thank you. Yes, PSEPA, the PSEPA Act targets, recognizes that there is inequality between men and women. And I would ask you to really to pay a lot of attention to the preamble, where the Parliament states what the purpose of the Act is. And it recognizes social harm caused by objectification. It recognizes that prostitution affects human dignity and undermines equality. And there's a disproportionate impact on women and children. And it says that Canada thinks it's important to denounce and prohibit the purchase of sexual services and to normalize and prevent the normalization and commercialization of prostitution. What's important to us about PSEPA is that it states very clearly that Canada does not want to develop economic dependency on prostitution as an industry.
Thank you, Ms. Jay. And do I have any time left, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you have 3 minutes left, 2.5 minutes left.
Oh, I thought I only had 2.5 minutes. Okay.
I leave that to your liberty. So if you want to end it in 2.5, or you can
I'll
go
end
to
it
5.
in 2.5. I'm trying to get along with everybody. Ms. Stevenson, we do hear some people speak, and it's like we're pretending that this is not exploitative. And you set out very clearly in your remarks from a personal perspective about how some people are being exploited, don't even realize till after they were being exploited. Can you just expand on that quickly? You mentioned the exploitative nature. Is it fair to say that this isn't exploitative in most cases?
Thank you. No, it's not fair to say that it's not exploitative in most cases. We know that I spoke briefly about cognitive dissonance and that idea. We have to learn about trauma bonding as well. People who find themselves in situations, especially when those situations are brought there, you're brought there because of desperation or survival, that you have to just make the situation you're in as appealing as possible, or you will suffer from the mental despair of constantly wishing you were somewhere that you cannot exit the situation. So I speak for myself, and I've spoken to a number of survivors who said, I spoke loudly about how much I enjoyed myself, or I was partying, or that I was okay with what I was doing because I needed to believe that in order to exist.
Thank you, Ms. Stevenson, thank you, Mr. Moore. Ms. Diab, I think you, for a quick 2 minutes.
2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you to my colleague, Mr. Moore there. Appreciate that. Ms. Clancy, I've got a question for you. I've got 2 questions. Let me just ask the 2 questions, and then if you don't mind, in the interest of time. In 2008, a report from the Prostitution Law Review Committee in New Zealand showed no expansion of the sex work industry following decriminalization. 1, can you please comment on that? And then my follow-up would be, do you think decriminalization in Canada would be similar and not expand the sex work industry in Canada, but would allow those currently in the industry to enjoy better protections?
Yes, I can't speak to specifically to the report that you're quoting from, but I do want to address the assertion that's been put forward before the committee that it will be a free-for-all in Canada with decriminalization. That is simply not going to happen. I mean, I know it's a different issue, and marijuana was legalized, not decriminalized, but the sky did not fall when marijuana was legalized in Canada. If sex work were to be decriminalized in Canada, it doesn't mean that people are going to turn out and start working in the sex industry in greater numbers than they are right now. So I just want to address that fear-mongering again that has happened in the committee. Decriminalization will not result in more people turning to the sex industry for their income generation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Clancy. And thank you to you, Chair. I know it's 4:00, so.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the witnesses.
Thank you to all the witnesses, and thank you, Ms. Diab. I will now conclude this part. There is some quick committee business that I can ask the members to just stay on for. So I believe the budget for